Hello, everybody. I'm Helena Cobban. I'm the president of Just World Educational, a small educational nonprofit located in Washington, D.C., in the traditional lands of the Piscataways. Today is June 8th, 2022. Today's webinar is part of a project we're running throughout June to educate new generations of Americans about the horrors of nuclear war, the reality of nuclear risk, and what we need to do as a society to step aside from these terrible risks once and for all. Our project is called The Urgency of Banning Nukes. Most young Americans who are under, say, 45 or 50 years old haven't had to worry much about the risk of nuclear annihilation during their whole adult lives. But now, nuclear war issues are firmly back on the table. It's a fairly scary topic to think and talk about, because the possibility of nuclear war brings a real possibility of the annihilation, not just of the whole of humankind, but also of most other forms of life on Earth. Nuclear winter is a real thing, and we need to understand how to avoid it. However, we also have some good news to talk about in our project, because at the level of global politics, we now, since January of last year, have a worldwide treaty in place called the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, the TPNW. But sadly, none of the 9 states that have nuclear weapons today have yet signed it. And the 2 biggest and scariest nuclear arsenals in the world today by far are those controlled by the United States and Russia. I see our job as anti-war Americans as being to build a movement that's strong enough to push our government to sign on to this very important treaty, the TPNW. It is sobering to remember that if nuclear annihilation happens, then it will be a much speedier form of annihilation than anything that climate change can cause. But first, we need to understand the issues around nuclear war, nuclear deterrence, and nuclear risk very well. And that is what this project on the urgency of banning nukes is all about. Please check out our website, www.justworldeducational.org, to learn more about the project, which will also include more webinars coming ahead every Wednesday and Saturday for the next few weeks. And please tell your friends and networks about them too. As you may have noticed, we have changed the format and scheduling of these online learning events a little from what we started off with on June 4th. But you can always see the latest info about the project if you go to the link on our homepage at www.justworldeducational.org. My co-host here today is our project manager, Amel Zaroug, and we have as our main guest and resource person, Ray McGovern, a feisty, dedicated, and very well-informed peace activist who back in 2003 was a co-founder of Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity. But before that, Ray headed up the Soviet Foreign Policy branch at the CIA, where he was very involved in the negotiations for key treaties like the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty and the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. Amel, why don't you start off with the questions you have for Ray McGovern about the nature of the nuclear threat historically and today, and what we can do about them, and I'll jump in with some questions of my own as needed. I will also be Zoom teching here in the background, pulling up the visuals that Amel or Ray want to share, and wrangling questions during the Q&A period that will follow their main discussion. So over to you, Amel.
Thank you, Helena. I'm just really delighted to have you here, Ray. And I think to start, I'd really appreciate it if you could give us a bit of context on your experience and work, and if you could talk about your involvement in SALT and also what that stands for.
Sure. Amel, I go back a ways here. Back in the early 70s, I was chief of the Soviet Foreign Policy branch at CIA. And our preoccupation in those first 2 years was with what we call the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, or SALT. It's later called SALT I when SALT II came along. Now, what was that all about? Well, there was a kind of a balance of terror where we kind of knew that the Russians could destroy us if we mounted an offensive nuclear war against Russia, and they knew that we could destroy them. So there was this balance of terror where everyone knew that it would kind of be foolhardy, and yet they might try. And the dangerous new phenomenon was the development of anti-ballistic missiles. Now, those were sold to President Reagan. He believed, now get this, he believed that you could shoot missiles and hit other missiles coming in, no matter how many decoys there were or how many missiles. He was led down the garden path by those who profiteer from developing such missiles. It's a very sad story because at one time, Gorbachev, who was president of Russia, proposed just deleting all these missiles. And Reagan said, well, that would be deleting all nuclear weapons, actually it was. And Reagan said, well, then he was brought aside by his advisor, said, Ronnie, that would mean that you wouldn't be able to develop this anti-ballistic missile system, which could defend the United States from all missiles. And so he said, no, I can't do that. Now that goes way back, okay? But even before that, people realized that there needed to be some kind of agreement whereby people would be restrained from trying to build anti-ballistic missiles, which at the time we thought might work. I mean, you can't assume they don't work, right? You're the Russian military, you can't assume they don't work, okay? And so, long story short, rather than build anti-ballistic missiles up and down the east and west coasts in the northern part of the United States and throughout Russia, the two sides were sensible enough to know that there must be a better way. So they started talking. And then something really unusual happened. President Nixon and Kissinger decided, you know, China is really afraid of Russia, and they have good reason to be afraid of Russia. They got 40 divisions on the Chinese border, for God's sake. Let's exploit that fear, cultivate relations with China, and then maybe the Russians will come to their senses and say, whoa, wait a second, we can't let the US and China develop really good relations. And that was the story. And I was in a catbird seat there because my branch was following that. We saw the Russians come around and develop ties with us that we had never seen before. The four-power agreement on Berlin. We never could agree on that kind of thing. It was agreed.
Hang on, Ray, what year, what period are we talking about?
We're talking about 1972, 1971, actually. That's when Nixon went to China. Thanks for asking, Helen. It's it was Nixon went to China in February of 1972. He went to Moscow in May of 1972. That's how quickly these things went. So not only the quadripartite agreement on Berlin was signed, but also they started to get really serious on the SALT talks. Now, I know this intimately because in my branch, I had 3 people working on SALT. One with the delegation, whether in Helsinki or Vienna, one with the military experts, and one writing these things up for the director of Central Intelligence and the president. So I got to go there. I got to be in Moscow in May of 1972 when the two sides came together and signed this agreement. Now, what was so special about this agreement? Well, they decided that rather than enter a race to build ABM sites, they would limit each side to 2, count them, 2. Would that be enough to defend the other country? Would that be enough for a country to assume, I can launch a first strike and I'll be protected by only 2 missile sites? No way. Later, 2 years later, they reduced it to 1 because it was just kind of a token. they were forbidden to build more than one. Now, that treaty formed the bedrock of strategic stability from May of 1972 until the lesser Bush, George W. Bush, got out of it 30 years later. 30 years of stability, knowing that no first strike could happen. No one would even try it because there was no defense against it. Why George W. Bush exited that treaty unceremoniously without explanation? You got to ask him. He's still around. He's making speeches even. He's even laughing at his war crimes. Don't cut me off on that. Okay, so I was there and I watched this miracle. I was in the opera with Kosygin, the Soviet premier, and Brezhnev, and Nixon, and Kissinger. And the next day they signed the thing. And I said, wow, whew. See, I grew up fearful. I grew up in the streets of New York, and I used to walk around and say, well, why are they building that building? I mean, it's good. It could easily be just knocked down like all these other buildings by a nuclear strike. So long story short, that was really a cornerstone of strategic stability. The strategic weapons were of limited use in a first strike. They'd never survived the retaliatory strike. Is that clear about the anti-ballistic missile, how it worked and all that? It was a treaty.
I have a sense. Yeah.
Okay. Now,
what is the ABM treaty?
Well, the ABM treaty was the treaty that limited each side to initially 2 ABM sites, and 2 years later, 1 ABM site, one around Moscow and one I think we had out there in Montana somewhere. So
if I could actually jump in here.
Sure.
My understanding of the ABM treaty and the contribution it made was that really it was a sort of acknowledgement by both Washington and Moscow that they were mutually vulnerable. And therefore, they couldn't get away with a first strike that would completely demobilize and destroy the other side. Is that right?
That's right. But there was this uncertainty with respect to anti-ballistic missiles that needed to be, categorized, put in a treaty so that both sides would limit their deployment of these missiles. Now, somebody asked me one time, well, did the Russians cheat, or what was your role in that, McGovern? And I said, well, our role was from political analysis, working very closely with the strategic people and the technical people. And when Nixon and Kissinger asked us, will the Soviets cheat? We said, probably. And they said, well, how soon would you be able to tell us? And we went back to the people who run the satellites and all that, and we got the answer, about 10 days. Okay, we can go with that. 10 days, you'll let us know. Guess what? In 1983, it was that the Russians built this great big ABM site in a place called Krasnoyarsk in the middle of Siberia. We detected it almost right away in the imagery that we took, and we called the Russians on it. We said, look, you're building another ABM site, tear it down. So tear it down came before tear down the Berlin Wall. Now, in those days, Reagan and his associates were calm enough to say, look, this, another ABM site is not going to change the world, but we got to call these guys on it. And it took about 6 years to get the Russians to say, all right, it's an ABM site. It violates the treaty. We'll tear it down. And they tore it down. The lesson there is trust, but verify. Okay. Doverai, no proverai in Russian. In other words, these agreements can be concluded if there's a solid way of verifying them. We caught them cheating. They tore the thing down. Now we could talk more about lesser range ballistic missiles, which
I'm also curious, did the US ever break the treaty? I mean, other than, formally backing out at the end.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the question.
Did the US break the treaty? Did they build other ABM sites?
Well, the US, when it exited the treaty, if that was your question,
Well, I meant before that, or no.
no, there was no explanation. And there was, in most treaties, there's you can give the other side a year's notice. Look, we're getting out of the treaty. And that's what happened. W. Bush almost immediately said that. And it took a year. And then all of a sudden, in 2002, the treaty was null and void. So here, put yourself in Mr. Putin's place, right? Why? Why would the Americans do this? They gave no explanation. The Russians sought an explanation, and they were said, just mind your own business. So that was the first thing that was incredibly destabilizing, especially given the history where both sides could live with this bedrock of stability, the anti-ballistic missile treaty. There were also treaties limiting offensive nuclear weapons, but they were less fundamental than the one banning ABM systems. Was that answer your question?
Yeah, somewhat. And what does a treaty do? I mean, what are the safeguards or processes of accountability, and why do they matter if the US can break them so easily?
Well, treaties are conducted by two sides who see mutual benefit in it. As I mentioned, not only was there mutual benefit in codifying the relationship between these two nuclear powers, but also the Russians saw real benefit in having a decent relationship with the United States in competition, actually, with the Chinese, who had just broken all precedent and developed cordial relations with the United States. So this triangular diplomacy played a role in there, a major role. But the treaty stood on its own merits, and the idea was to prevent the creation of more and more ostensible capability to protect against a strike, so that neither side would say, I think we could do a first strike now. A first strike meaning knocking out all strategic missiles of all kinds so that there could be no retaliation. There's no longer any possibility of a first strike. As a matter of fact, never has it been more speakable to say an attack from one from the other. And one of the big flies in the ointment is the fact that although we have really good coverage of any ballistic missile firing from anywhere in the world, the Russians do not. This is big, okay? The Russians have not refined their satellite imagery or their satellite capabilities to the point where they have our capability. So, as MIT professor Ted Postel relates, there was an incident where a rocket went up from Norway. Now, it crossed where the Russians actually have a view into our ICBM sites, intercontinental ballistic missile sites in northern part of the United States. And when their radar detected it, they didn't know if this was a ballistic missile strike. Now, they had other information, no doubt, from spies and other people, that there was no unusual activity out there in Montana and Wyoming and all that kind of stuff. So that was a little bit reassuring, but they didn't know anything about our ballistic missile submarines, which are capable of destroying the whole Soviet Union 3 times over. They took a chance and said, well, let's wait, okay? Now, the wait time there was probably about 25, 30 minutes. And lo and behold, it turned out that it was a research rocket by the Norwegians to try to see more about the Milky Way, all right? Now, the reason I mention that is because Ted Postel has talked to the generals who were in the Situation Room during that very tense time when they didn't know whether they were under attack at all.
So hang on, we're talking Soviet generals.
Yes, Soviet generals. Yeah. So in other words, well, Ted wasn't there with the Soviet generals at the
Right,
time.
right. But he talked to them later.
Yes, but his contacts with them and the mutual respect that they enjoy allowed them to tell him this really scary story. Now, people assume that since the Russians can do all manner of other things, highly sophisticated things with rockets and missiles and so forth, that their early warning capability is also very much improved. But you know what? It isn't. You need certain satellites to do what we do in the United States. They only have one. You need at least three. And there are all kinds of other defects in the Russian system that add a degree of tentativeness, of vulnerability, of real danger that the Russians might decide that, oh, this is the real thing, not just a research rocket on its way to the Milky Way. And the time between firing and target has diminished greatly from the 30-35 minutes that we used to have with the ICBMs. It's much less now, and it's much more dangerous now. And you know, the examples of close calls are myriad, and I can relate one or two others to you if you're interested.
I would be interested. Yeah. And I'm also curious as to, I mean, I've been reading that, you know, we're closer to nuclear war than we have been in a really long time. And I'd like to know your read on this. I mean, what would need to happen for a nuclear strike to be called by either side?
What would it have to happen for?
For a nuclear strike to be called by either side? I mean, how close are we to nuclear war right now?
Well, let me give you two examples. One goes back to the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I would stress in passing.
Cuban Missile Crisis, what year, Ray? Come on.
Right, okay. I hope it's made the history books. The Cuban Missile Crisis was in 1962. It was an interesting crisis because the intelligence system the United States had confidently predicted in September of 1962 that the Russians would never try to put nuclear ballistic missiles in Cuba. Never. They knew what our reaction would be. They'd never try it. Okay. Well, 1 month later, some of our reconnaissance aircraft, called in those days the U-2s, found in photography Soviet ballistic missiles in Cuba. Well, we very proudly went to the president, so we found them, they're there. And he said, I thought you told me they weren't, well, they're there, okay. So President Kennedy said, okay, what are we gonna do? We can't take this just lying down. Are they armed? Do they have nuclear warheads on them? And US intelligence confidently said, we assess that there are no nuclear weapons ready to fire on these missiles. Wrong. They were ready to fire. We learned that 3 decades later. So this gives a little bit of electricity to this whole thing. We didn't know, the president didn't know, John Kennedy wasn't smart enough at that time to say, what do you mean you assess? Does that mean you guess or do you know? And we would have said, well, we don't know, okay? Anyhow, he acted very responsibly, okay? And he said, look, the Russians are trying to create really a strategic danger for us. It's an existential threat, for God's sake. If they can knock out our naval bases on the East Coast and blow up our cities, we got to get rid of these things. And in a very adroit way, he and Khrushchev, who was the party head at the time in Moscow, worked out an arrangement where there would be a quid pro quo. The missiles would be taken out of Cuba and we would take missiles out of Turkey. A nice, sensible arrangement. Now, why do I mention that? I mention that because right after, well, just in the middle of these discussions, there was a Soviet submarine near Cuba, okay? And they had nuclear torpedoes and they were armed, okay? They were out of communication with Moscow for about 4 days. They knew that the balloon was up. They had to assume that they lost the war, okay? And so 2 captains on this Soviet submarine said, well, you know, use them or lose them. At least if we're going to go down, let's take 5 or 6 US ships in the Caribbean here down with us. Let's shoot those torpedoes off, okay? And they were all ready to switch the key when they were, oh, wait a second. There's the political naval captain here. We have to get his okay. In other words, the Russians had insisted that they would have a party guy and also a captain, and he would be necessary to turn the switch. His name was Arshipov, okay? And he said, do you have orders from Moscow? And they said, no, but the war is lost. We figured it out. He said, you don't have orders from Moscow? You don't shoot those missiles. You surface. They surface, and they find out that the war, there was no war, that people have come to this agreement. And that's how close we came. In other words, if that would have started a nuclear exchange, for sure. That was right at the very end of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, let me say just one more time that the kind of missiles I hope we'll discuss a little bit later, placed in Poland, Romania, and God forbid, Ukraine, pose an existential threat to Putin's Russia. It's the same deal. It's the kind of thing that no president of any country can tolerate, being right under the gun of medium range and other ballistic missiles. So when Putin's looking at this, he knows about the Cuban Missile Crisis, and he knows how we reacted. And I think he probably says, you know, why can't they understand that I react the same way to the emplacement of missiles right on Russia's border?
Could I just interject with a couple of things here? One is, Amel, if you could make me co-host, that would be awesome. Ray, you said that there are medium-range missiles now in Poland, American missiles in Poland and Romania, and God forbid Ukraine, but they're not in Ukraine, right?
They're not, no. As a matter of fact, there's an anomaly that I can't quite explain. And that is simply this. Maybe somebody listening will be able to research this and help me out. You'll remember that late last year, actually it was earlier in December of last year, Biden and Putin agreed that there would be negotiations on these issues. That was 7th of December, I believe. And they agreed, as Putin had insisted, that this be done, you know, not next summer, but immediately, right? So they set up a negotiation process to begin in Geneva on the 12th of January 2022, this year. Then all of a sudden, the White House gets a call from the Kremlin. Mr. Putin wants to talk to Mr. Biden right now, like tomorrow. On the 30th of December 2021, there's this exchange between Biden and Putin. We don't have much from the American side, but the Russian readout said, and I quote, Mr. Joseph Biden said that the United States has no intention of putting offensive strike missiles in Ukraine, period, end quote. There was great rejoicing among Putin's associates and in the Russian press at that undertaking, but there was nothing about it in the US press. Now, that's a biggie. If Biden, well, number one, nobody contested the Russian readout of that meeting. The US just didn't say much about the meeting at all. So based on past experience, that means that, you know, there was nothing, that this was true. This was an undertaking by Biden, a personal undertaking, one-on-one president to president directly on the telephone. Now, what happened? The negotiations began on the 12th of January. Nothing more was said about Biden's undertaking that the US had no intention of putting offensive strike weapons in Ukraine. It kind of fell into never land. My diagnosis and my suggestion is that after Biden made that undertaking, or promise, if you will, his associates said, "Joe, come on, man, those are big high cards in our hand. Forget about it. Forget about it." I don't know why it was forgot about, but it was forgot about. And if I were Putin, I would say, "Whoa, I can't even trust a personal one-on-one direct promise from the president of the United States on this key question." And I think that went into Putin's calculus as to what he figured he really needed to do the following month when he invaded Ukraine and made it physically impossible for sites, including those kinds of missiles, to go up, at least in the Donbass part of Ukraine. So that's that's what we talk about when we talk about missiles of intermediate range. If I may, Amel, let me talk about the treaty that regulated those, because I think it kind of sets the stage for what this all means. I was briefing President Reagan's most senior advisors from 1981 to 1985, one-on-one. Now, people say, "Did you see the president?" Well, these were early morning briefings, and the president preferred to kind of sleep in, all right? So he met with these same people at 11:30. So I had I would brief Secretary of State Schultz, Secretary of Defense Weinberger, any number of assistants to the President for National Security Affairs. They kind of rotated, and some of them ended up in prison, and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and last but not least, the Vice President of the United States, George H.W. Bush. That was big duty. That was really big duty. And when Gorbachev, the Soviet Party official, ascended to the head of the Soviet Communist Party, the question was this the real deal? He sounds very different. And my bosses, Bill Casey, the secretary, the head of the CIA, and Bobby Gates, who was his Soviet guy, said, no, he's just a more clever commie. He's just, just pull the wool over all eyes. A commie is a commie. The Communist Party, the Soviet Union, will never, ever give up power peaceably. Well, honest analysts and I thought otherwise. And as we watched Gorbachev take hold, we were convinced that he was willing to deal. And sure enough, Secretary Schultz went over there to confirm that. And then Gorbachev said, "Look, we could talk about nuclear strategic missiles, but you put those Pershing II missiles in Western Europe. They're medium-range ballistic missiles. They can hit Moscow in 9 minutes. I don't want to have 9 minutes to decide whether to blow up the rest of the world. We have these SS-20s that can destroy all of Europe. As soon as we see one of these Pershings go up, let's eliminate them all." No, when I heard of that, I said, "Oh, right. This ain't never going to happen." Guess what? It happened. 1985 is when Gorbachev suggested it. 1987, we had the Treaty on Intermediate Range Nuclear Ballistic Missiles. Okay, now that limited the range from 500 kilometers to 5,500 kilometers, and that was in place until Trump, for reasons best known to Trump, got out of the INF Treaty the same way that Bush Jr. got out of the Strategic Arm Limitation Treaty. No explanation, but right away we had some emplacements of missile installations in Romania and in Poland, which Helena just mentioned, that were said to be anti-ballistic missiles. But really, when people said, well, who are you defending against? North Korea, no, not North Korea, Iran.
Iran.
Yeah. And, and then, well, wait a second. Iran just signed an agreement where they can't possibly do anything for 10 years. Well, they may violate, it was just implausible. Now, what I would ask is if we could play a short video, and if you fall asleep, you're going to miss the whole thing because it's only 2.5 minutes or so. It's a video that shows Putin after he had argued many times with US officials. This is in 2015. He said, look, we can't go on like this without limiting these missiles. And you say that the ABM sites there in Poland and Romania are.
Well, hang on. Let's look at the actual video. It's introduced by you on the video.
Okay,
Ray.
good.
So here it is.
I won't steal my own thunder. Oh, who's that young guy? Can you hear?
The sound's not coming through very well.
It is? Okay.
Oh.
I wonder if it's possible to turn it up.
Wait, why don't I bring it down to the other?
I can't hear anything.
Okay. Sorry about this, people. So it wasn't. Oh, you know what? Here.
Your audio is not quite coming through, Helena, or at least it froze for me.
Whoa. Okay, now let's try the audio again. Screen share, stop share. Okay, stop share. I can't stop the sharing. Well, shall I try this again?
Yeah, and if it doesn't work, then I'll try screen sharing.
Missile defense systems are able to squelch their offensive capability.
I hear it now.
Thing, and you'll see from this segment, which I hope will go on just a few seconds now, how Putin really is kind of beside himself, because as you can see, some of these Western journalists say, oh, that's interesting. Yeah. So let's have that second clip, please.
Угрозы нет, а система ПРО продолжает строиться. Значит, мы были правы, когда говорили, что нас обманывают. С нами неискренне, ссылаясь на иранскую ядерную угрозу при строительстве системы ПРО. Ну, так оно и есть, на самом деле. В очередной раз пытались нас надуть. Сейчас построили эту систему. Сейчас ставят там ракеты. Так? Но вам должно быть известно, что ракеты эти закладываются в капсулу, которая используется.
Shall I go back? Was that working at all? Was that coming through?
I was here.
The video.
Sorry, Amel, was that coming through?
The audio was, but not the video.
Oh, the video is quite
important in the.
Okay, let me try this over. Why does screen sharing always, anyway. It's just not, I have no screen sharing capability. I will work on this. Okay, maybe we just need to characterize it, I can tell you that it was Putin going really quite angry in 2015 when with some Western journalists. And Ray had found this beautiful clip of Putin saying, you know, they say it's to protect from Iran, but they lied to us. They lied to us. And I guess this is not Putin's general way of talking. Ray, you said he seemed more agitated than usual.
Yeah, the main points he tried to make was not only that they lied to us about it being a anti-ballistic missile system, or that it was aimed at defending from Iran, but that these capsules, these installations that they put already in Romania and are almost finished in Poland, they are of the same proportions to tolerate Tomahawk missiles, cruise missiles, offensive missiles, in direct violation of what had been the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. Now, ironically enough, Trump hadn't even left that yet. But as soon as he did leave that in 2019, then these Aegis developed for ships. The cruise missiles, they're put on shore, and they can easily be converted, slipping a new little CD in overnight into offensive missiles. And this is the point that that Putin is making to these Western journalists. He says, look, we know, we have the Pentagon plans. We know exactly what they're doing. There'll be ABMs for a little while, and then we know when they plan to make them into capsules suitable for firing offensive cruise missiles. And the point is, as Putin later explained, if there are offensive missiles on the border of Russia in Romania, which they already are, and in Poland, that is, the installations are already there, then the intercontinental ballistic missile capability in Russia is in danger, as is Moscow, and in danger in, guess what, like 7 to 9 minutes. And if hypersonic missiles are put in there, which the US will inevitably eventually have, the Russians haven't now, then it would be 5 to 7 minutes. So let's just think about this. I'm Vladimir Putin, right? And I say, okay, now these missiles, they fly real fast, the hypersonic ones, or even these cruise missiles, not so fast, but they endanger our entire ICBM force. How much time will I have to decide whether to destroy the rest of the world? I mean, that's what it amounts to, folks. A nuclear exchange will ipso facto destroy the rest of the world. So here's Putin saying, what? You say 4 to 5 minutes? Give me a break. We have to stop that. And in my view, this is largely what the Russian intervention in Ukraine is all about. They made this point for 6 or 7 years to the US administrations. They weren't listened to. The sites continued to be developed until, as I mentioned, the only exception was Biden saying, okay, on the 30th of December, saying, let's say we have no intention of putting offensive strike missiles in Ukraine. All of a sudden, that disappears from the horizon. So Putin says, look, this is getting really, 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 really dangerous for us. Besides that, it looks like the Ukrainian army is gearing up to attack the eastern provinces of Donetsk and Luhansk. And that's, that would form the background of why he decided to do what he did. So to say that his invasion of Ukraine was unprovoked is a bald-faced lie. It was provoked, and the US knows that better than anyone else. Do I favor invading other countries? Of course not, but I can understand where Putin was coming from And again, the US media and the Western media has really been very misleading in saying this was unprovoked. As I see it, Putin was looking at defending his own country. He didn't want to have just 4 to 5 minutes or 5 to 7 minutes to decide whether he was under nuclear attack. And so that's one of the reasons why he did what he did, in my view.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, Ray, this is so grim. I mean, what can we do? Is the TPNW a solution? And what do you think it would take to wrangle away nuclear weapons from the American military?
Well, it's going to take some strong advocacy. It's going to take some strong movement. Now, I would appeal to people not to be discouraged. Discouragement is not what we need, okay? I remember back in the 70s, Quakers, Catholic workers, other people going out with signs, ban the bomb, ban the bomb. And the reaction was, oh, how admirable, but how pitiful, This will never gather steam. And lo and behold, a decade later, 1 million people demonstrating in New York and elsewhere, ban the bomb, ban the bomb. And that was one reason why we got some of these treaties, why we got some sensible legislation. So don't give up. I mean, this is what it takes. It takes people really getting into it and understanding, first and foremost, what's going on. Now, I'll bet you that not 1 out of 100 Americans realize that Putin has this dilemma, that he wants more than 5 to 7 minutes to decide whether he's under nuclear attack. The implication of that is very, very clear, of course. It has to be automated, right? It has to be down to the machines with the sergeants and the lieutenant colonels, and they detect this research scientific rocket going up near Norway, and they say, "Oh my God, we're under attack." They don't have time to call and say, "Get Putin on the line." Well, yeah, we think we're no. They say their orders are to push the button. Push the button. Unlike the Cuban Missile Crisis, where you had a political party guy, a captain, naval captain, to say, no, we can't do this without orders from Moscow. In this case, the timing is such, orders from Moscow are impossible, okay? Now, that's big. That's a big deal. And when you add the reality that the Russian early warning system is not as good as ours, and that they cannot depend to be aware of all ballistic missile firings wherever they happen on the globe, as we can, then that just compounds the problem. And when you come right down to it, do we want to destroy anybody? I don't think so. Not American. Not. Do people want to profiteer on building all these systems? Of course they do. But there are more of us than there are of them. And I think we really have to just kind of put our bodies into it. And ban the bomb signs have to go up, not with 100 people carrying them, but with 1 million people carrying them. And we have to be willing to do business. We have to be willing to be arrested. I've been arrested many times. I've always survived. So put your body into it, get your friends together and say, this is serious. These people are not taking it seriously. They're talking about a limited nuclear attack or limited nuclear war. It's crazy stuff. We have to combat that, make sure people are aware of what the stakes are. And, it's really up to us. And we still have the freedom to do that. I don't know for how much longer, but let's carpe diem, seize the moment and do what we have to do.
So I'd like to actually come in here with a follow-up, because Amel raised a great point, and you raised a great point. Like, there was that big, 1 million person march in New York City exactly 40 years ago. And as you had said, Ray, it helped us get the INF Treaty and other things, but it did not result in banning the bomb. And when I talked with Richard Falk about a month ago, he was quite clear, and I'm not sure if I agree with him or not, but he was stating quite categorically that actually arms control agreements are antithetical to the prohibition of nuclear weapons, because they give us the illusion that we can control this genie. So what do you think about the relationship between arms control agreements, some of which you were in your earlier incarnation as a CIA person, you were very involved in negotiating, the relationship between arms control arrangements, treaties, and actually prohibiting the whole goddamn class of nuclear weapons and dismantling these nuclear arsenals? I mean, what is that relationship?
Well, I have a sort of a bipolar answer to that, not in the literal sense, I hope. I think nuclear weapons are immoral. I think they should be banned. And there is now a treaty that we can point to where I think the last time I looked, is it 130 countries have signed on already to this treaty? And it's the ultimate, it's ban the bomb. And it makes great sense. Now, the other pole is the reality that people make a lot of money on developing new nuclear weapons and all that kind of thing. As a matter of fact, there are trillions, $1 trillion is earmarked for the next 10 years to develop even fancier, even better nuclear weapons, when we need that money, as everyone knows, right here at home. So I think what needs to happen maybe is that we have to talk about opportunity costs, okay? Now this is something tangible, right? As most people know in economic terms, opportunity costs is when you decide to build an F-35 aircraft and it costs $1 billion. Well, what opportunities elsewhere in our country, schools, medical care, all the things that are crying out for repair or renewal, what's the cost there? What's the opportunity cost of not doing those things and instead building a fighter that probably doesn't work anyway? Well, the difference is a lot of people get very rich doing this, okay? And we know who those people are. We know these CEOs now are making making millions and millions of dollars. Many of them are indeed billionaires. So there's this dysfunction here, and we need to make very clear to people, look, you live in Pennsylvania. You can't fund your school systems. We're just going to pay $3 billion to build 5 more F-35s. Let's not do that. Let's instead fix the schools, fix the healthcare, fix whatever else needs fixing, immigration and so forth. Those are concrete opportunity costs. And if we can take that money and say, all right, this is what we could do. This is the opportunity we have that we neglect by paying these profiteers billions of dollars. I think we can do that. We're smart enough. We can figure out how much it costs to do these things that are so much needed within the country, and just say, well, look, this is what Lockheed, this is what Raytheon, this is what they're all bragging about. We can do more and more because of Ukraine. They're bragging to their stockholders, and we got to rein them in. And we can. We know where they live. We know how much money they're making out of these missed opportunities for the rest of the people. And of course, the poor people in our country are the ones that take it worst.
So Amel, do you have more questions?
I also want to open it up to If there's anyone in the audience that would like to ask a question, our Q&A feature is open. But otherwise, I'm happy to keep talking.
I'm just going to try screen sharing again. You know, it is not working for me, so I'm not going to try it. Okay.
I could try screen sharing. The option is open to me if that's something. Oh.
I could one disconcerting factor, as if we needed yet another. That is that according to Ted Postel, the eminent physicist, professor emeritus from MIT, who worked very closely at the highest positions, right under the Office of Naval Operations. He tells me that he is really aghast at the caliber of professional that now has charter over these incredibly consequential decisions. He says, let me quote him here. He says, it really is very, very sad to watch how people are promoted beyond where they're knowledgeable about these things. He says that many people that do the kinds of things he used to do are supremely non-qualified. Now, if you put that together with the clearly non-qualified foreign policy advisors and with the clearly non-qualified economic advisors that Putin has surrounding him.
No, not Putin, Biden.
Not Putin, yeah, not Biden.
I mean, I don't know about the quality of Putin's, but
yeah, it shows I have Putin on my mind. No, I mean Biden, of course. I mean, Ted Postel has dealt with them. He's been aghast at how when major decisions will be made, that those people will be called upon to rule of whether we live or die. Now, again, if you put yourself in Putin's place, he's looking on. He's reading what Ted Postel writes. He knows who's making these decisions. Is there a degree of tentativeness there, a degree of delicacy, a degree of fear? You bet there is. In other words, Putin can't be sure that reason will prevail among those close to Joe Biden. He's already decided, in my view, that when he talks to Joe Biden and extracts a promise from him, he can't count on Biden following through. Now, I had not seen so labil, is the German word. It's delicate how itsy-kitsy this situation is. I haven't seen it so bad in the decades, 5 or 6 decades that I've been watching Soviet and then Russian leaders. So what we need to do, actually, is rally the troops here, rally the movement, and get people to realize what's going on and prevent the worst from happening. And that starts with Ukraine here. And I just finish this segment here by saying that, the syllogism that the intelligence people and the policy people have constructed is crazy. Here it is, okay? Putin considers the emplacement, or Putin considers the Ukraine an existential threat. We've talked about why he would, okay? We don't want to get involved in a nuclear war, okay? If Putin loses in Ukraine, he has already warned, in effect, that he has nuclear weapons and there could be a high risk of nuclear war. Would nuclear war be certain? No, it wouldn't, but there will be the risk of nuclear war, okay? Therefore, and this is where the craziness comes in, therefore we should defeat Putin. Therefore, we should have complete victory, as Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer says, and drive him to the wall. And if it risks nuclear weapons, well, maybe he won't use them. Well, my opinion is that he would first go to his big partner, China, and say, look, we need to work together on this. You're the next target. Let's see what we can do to face these people down. If China, for whatever reason, is reluctant to support Putin as strongly as they have so far, then, but only then, would I think that Putin would do kind of, would even consider some kind of nuclear application. I don't think that's likely, but even the risk, I mean, hello, the risk was so great when I was a boy. Then we attenuated it, and now it's come back in spades, and all because of a godforsaken war that was not unprovoked. That was provoked by NATO, and the history is clear on that. We need to be honest about that.
So we have a very good question here from Elizabeth Axtell in the Q&A. She is asking, why are progressives in Congress reluctant to criticize Biden and his advisors for their policies regarding Ukraine and nuclear weapons? Maybe these are two slightly different things, because we do have a little bit of a movement of progressives in Congress who have signed on to Eleanor Holmes Norton's bill for abolition of nuclear weapons, but they all seem to line up behind, the $40 billion for weapons to Ukraine. But Ray, how would you answer the question?
Well, that all the Democrats lined up behind that 40 billion gift to Ukraine is very distressing. Very, very distressing. All of them. Well, that's one of them. And, people can consider it rather cynical to explain it this way, but how else to explain it? Most, if not all of these people feed off the proceeds from the sale of arms. God, you shouldn't take the Pope to point this out, but he did come to Congress in 2015 and said, and I quote, "The main problem is the blood-drenched arms traders," end quote. And all the congressmen got up, they're, oh, right. Then they looked in their pocket to see if the latest envelope from Raytheon was there, and the one from Lockheed was, it was giving hypocrisy a bad name, But there it is. They all get funded. They all get elected. Then they appropriate money for the arms trade. The arms traders get a lot of money. They take some of it and they put it in the pockets of the Congress people. They get reelected. They appropriate more money for, hello, is this a great country or what? That's how it works. Now, besides all that, you have the media that is really subordinate to the corporations that control them. The mass media are supporting all this, and to stand up against the pressure of not doing everything you can for Zelensky, it takes a little guts. And I still think there should have been some Democrats with a little bit of guts, but there was zero. There were a bunch of Republicans that voted against it for whatever reason, but that shows how much the media is involved in shaping public opinion so that the military industrial intelligence media complex can profiteer. I don't say profit, I say profiteer on tension, and on war, and on the arms that they're so eager to sell when we need that money desperately at home.
Actually, talking about the media, I wrote a piece on the blog on Just World Educational's website today about Tom Friedman, who about a month ago started to write about his questions about, we shouldn't let Zelensky have everything he wants, and we have to be a little bit restrained. And then he gets invited to lunch with the president. And then like 3 days later, he's writing, this is so scary. We've got to give everything that we can to Zelensky, practically speaking. So it's all about like sort of access journalism, I would say. But anyway, that is the mainstream media. We have a question from Gwen Dubois. I hope I pronounced your name right. Aren't strategic missiles just as dangerous as short range in terms of the few minutes from launch to arrival? And she also wants to know where we can read more about Biden's broken promise about missiles in Ukraine.
Very good questions. Let me handle the last one first. I've been asking all Russian experts that I know to explain to me what happened to that promise by Biden. All I have really is the Russian readout, and that's on the Kremlin website. It's in English as well as in Russian. And then the bragging that Ushakov, for example, one of Putin's closest advisors, did the next day. They were just ecstatic. Oh, this is really, really good. I mean, no offensive strike missiles in Ukraine. That's a good start. Now, bear in mind, that was the 30th of December of last year. I often just wondered why it was that even though they had set up the negotiations to happen on the 12th of January, why it was that the Kremlin called the White House and said, no, we talked, that is Putin and Biden talked on the 7th of December. We need to talk again. We need to talk before the end of the year. How about the 30th December? So it was the Russians that wanted to talk. What did they want? Well, it seems to me from their readout that they wanted a pledge that Biden would not put offensive strike missiles in Ukraine. And he said that the US had no intention of doing that. Well, okay, what happened to that? So the answer is, I don't know. And I'd be really happy to find out what happened to that. Now, the first part of the question was having to do with, can you help me, Helena?
Hang on, it's over here.
Oh yeah, I think I remember now. Strategic missiles range and now the time to. Well, last time I checked, these ICBMs in Nebraska or Montana, the ones out in Siberia, they traditionally have taken about a half hour, 35, 25 minutes from launch to target, okay? These intermediate range ballistic missiles, which Trump got out of that treaty, the INF Treaty, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, they take 9 minutes. The Pershing IIs we had in Western Europe took 9 minutes to take Moscow out, to take other sites out. And the SS-20s in Russia didn't need any more. Close by they were to really destroy Western Europe. Now, wasn't it some sort of a miracle? Maybe this is a reason for hope. Gorbachev said, hey, I don't want to be in a position of having only a few minutes to decide. Do you guys? And well, guess not, So let's destroy them. Now, as I said before, I said, yeah, right. They're going to destroy a whole class of short range and medium range, intermediate range ballistic missiles. 500 kilometers to 5,500 kilometers in range. And they did. And Scott Ritter, my good friend, and other good friends went to Siberia and personally supervised the destruction of those SS-20s. And I have other friends here in the United States where the Russians came in and watched the destruction, or they came into Western Europe, of course, watched the destruction of Pershing IIs. So it can be done.
Yeah, I mean, that's really good news, actually, isn't it? You know, that there is the track record of the dismantling of an entire class of weapons. So it's not like you have to invent the wheel again. How do you do this? How do you verify it? Blah, blah, blah. Let's just do it.
Yeah. What was needed then was a Ronald Reagan who was willing to be educated, and a George H.W. Bush who was willing to help educate him, and a Mikhail Gorbachev who was willing to meet with him, meet with his Secretary of State, talk about these things. When they met in Reykjavik, Iceland, my God, they almost agreed to abolish all nuclear weapons. I told you that before. So it is possible. All we need is kind of a rational human being, not tied to the military-industrial complex, that can think these things through and say, do I really want to be in a position as delicate as giving the Russians only 5 to 7 minutes to decide whether they need to wipe us off the map? You know, they asked Putin, it was Putin this time, they asked Putin after he won his last election, okay? They said, now, President Putin, if there were a strike, a strategic strike on Russia, and it was already launched, and Russia would be destroyed, would you really push the button to destroy the rest of the world? It's not a strange question. I looked at them and I said, well, what the rest of the world be like without Russia? So, you know, I have little doubt that as rational or sensible it might be to hold off and say, well, let's at least let the Americans and the Mexicans and the Canadians live. That's not going to happen. It's going to go. And I think you don't have to be crazy to, well, you would be crazy not to expect that would be the reaction of a Russian leader. So,
Amel, do you want to ask a couple of the other questions?
Sure. So I think there's another question here. Marcy Matasik, I'm sorry if I butchered your name, is asking, where can we find the details of the Minuteman ballistic missile launch protocols and sequence, which I think you would be best qualified to tell us.
I'm sorry, where could we find?
The details of the Minuteman ballistic missile launch protocols and sequence.
Well, I think I'd start with Google. Really, it's a lot of this stuff is quite out open in the open. And of course, the Russians and the Americans know about it. But the Minuteman, most people think that it's really kind of outlived its usefulness, that with all these other, especially the seaborne ballistic missiles, which alone not only can destroy Russia and China together several times over, but cannot be detected easily. I mean, that's the whole thing about these submarines. It's really hard to detect them. They're as quiet as a lot quieter than my air conditioner. Okay, so you know, these things really are not, you know, they're not special science or anything. They're just facts, and the more people know the facts, the better, and the more they're willing to realize the danger. Let me give you just one more example, if you'd like, about how close we came at a period of tension similar to the one that exists now. Would you like me to do that? Okay.
Yes, please.
Okay, this was 1983. I was briefing 1983. But all of this that I'm going to say is public knowledge. KAL 007 was shot down. This was a Korean airliner with almost 300 people on it. It was shot down by Soviet air defense over Siberia. It wandered well thousands of kilometers into Soviet airspace and was shot down. That was a big cause célèbre, of course, and the Russians were charged with deliberately shooting that passenger plane down. Now, I have to be careful what I say here. Let me just say this, that the Russians deliberately shot that plane down. Did they know it was a passenger plane? No. They thought it was a US spy plane. Now, why was it that when we presented our case at the UN, only part of the intercepted conversations between control tower and pilot were revealed? Because the whole thing would have shown that the Russians did not know that it was a civilian aircraft. They thought it was a military aircraft. And we know that that was excised from what was shown at the UN. How do we know that? Well, the fellow in charge of the State Department video shop confessed to that in a book he wrote. About 10 years later. And what was his conclusion? His conclusion was, and I quote, "All countries lie, including us. The one who wins is the one who lies first." Okay, that's the background, okay? So the Russians know they didn't do, they know they deliberately shot it down, but they didn't know, they know that we know because our commo is so good. And after that, there were all kinds of really, really hot issues. By October, we were running an exercise, which was a full dress strategic forces exercise in which the Vice President of the United States, for the first time, was participating. Now, my friends working directly on the Soviet Union realized that the Russians thought this was the real thing. They sent out all kinds of queries to the KGB people. Is this the real thing? Are they doing the real thing here? We're really agitated. Now, my colleagues were so convinced that this was so dangerous, they went to Bobby Gates, who was the deputy director for intelligence, and they said, "We need to tell the White House, the Russians think this is the real thing." He said, "Don't worry about it." So to their credit, they went to Bill Casey, the director. And they said, "Look, Mr. Casey, even we might be wrong about this, but think of the stakes here." Casey went then to the White House, called the participation of the vice president, called the thing off pretty much, toned it down, and the Russians in turn toned down their retaliatory capability. That was really close. That was called that was in October, November. Able Archer was the name of the exercise from our side. The Russians were beside themselves. Andropov, the head of the KGB, was the head Soviet person then. So you not only have Arkhipov in 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis, you have 1983, you have the Norwegian satellite in the 90s, not the Norwegian satellite, the Norwegian rocket. So you have a lot of close calls, many of which we don't know about, obviously. So the time is to kind of face up to it and say, neither of us is going to prevail in a nuclear exchange. For God's sake, start talking about it. We have a treaty. Why don't we get together and abolish these nuclear weapons? It would be for everybody's benefit, including you might even get the Chinese to sign on to that, because the Chinese, to their credit, have pledged themselves no first use. In other words, they will not be the first to use nuclear weapons. The Russians and we have not made that pledge. That would be a good starting point. to get the U.S. and Russia to do that. And really good people who are responsible for getting that treaty drafted and signed. I think it's about 4 or 5 years ago now that it came into being, and they are to be applauded. Nobody thought they could possibly do it. And as I say, most of the countries of the world are for it, except those 9 or 10 that have nuclear weapons already. And of course, that includes Israel, as well as Pakistan and India.
And then we have one more question. I don't know if you have the time, Helena.
Sure.
Yeah, from Richard Ox. Is the reopening of the US embassy in Ukraine with US troops as dangerous as a no-fly zone?
Okay, could you repeat it more slowly?
Mm-hmm. Is the reopening of the US embassy in Ukraine with US troops as dangerous as a no-fly zone?
Well, the answer is no, it's not as dangerous as a no-fly zone. But my understanding is that they're in Lviv right now, and that they could open up the embassy in Kiev. If there are a couple of Marines around that embassy, I don't think the Russians are going to feel very threatened by a couple of US Marines around that embassy. So I think there's really no comparison between the two. A no-fly zone would mean the probability of war with Russia. We've been pretty careful to avoid that until now. But if what Ted Postal tells me about the caliber of the people advising Biden is true, and if Putin has the same opinion of these people, that's a very delicate situation. That increases the danger that one side will assume the worst of the other, whether by incompetence or by design, and the flag will be up. And as Ted Postal puts it very, very delicately, we'll all be dead. Dead. Not mostly dead, but dead.
Well, gosh, but there is something we can do about it. So that's why we are doing this series of webinars in order to help educate new generations of Americans who, for some reason, and we can discuss this at some point, really have not thought about or internalized or explored the dangers of nuclear confrontation in a way that back in the 1970s and 1980s, people felt more like motivated to do. And then the Cold War ended in roughly 1990. And since then, Americans, in as much as they've been interested in foreign policy, have become diverted to a lot of different things, like atrocity prevention or climate change, both of which are very worth focusing on, but the nuclear issue has not gone away, and that's why we're running this project. So I really want to thank Ray McGovern and our project manager, Amel Zaroug, for really opening up this sort of what you might call an intergenerational skills and knowledge exchange that we really, really need to pursue. So this project at Just World Educational has a number of different arms, running this webinar series, which will be every Wednesday at 7 p.m. Eastern and every Saturday at noon Eastern. Will continue for the next few weeks, not sure how many weeks exactly. But please come back on Saturday this Saturday when we're going to have Vicki Elson, who is the creative director of an organization called nuclearban.us. And I urge you to go to their website, which is just that, nuclearban.us, which is the US affiliate of the organization, this amazing sort of transnational non-governmental organization called the International Coalition for the Abolition of Nuclear Weapons, ICAN, which is great. You know, we all can. We can abolish. nuclear weapons. So that Vicky Elson, we're really delighted that she's going to be with us on Saturday. Another thing that we're doing is we're putting quite a lot of relevant materials onto our website, especially onto the blog space on our website. So head there, www.justworldeducational.org. And if you just click on the blog, you'll find lots and lots of recent things, well, 5 or 6, which is a start. And then we are going to build up all these resources and more, including the multimedia records of these webinars and other things that we find will be really useful, into an online learning hub that hopefully community organizations and classroom teachers and churches and congregations can use, because educating, and it's not just people in Amel's generation, it's people, I would say, up to about the age of 50 who have had the pleasure of growing up in a world where they didn't have to think about nuclear war until now. Suddenly we all do. So we've got to get this kind of knowledge, and it's not just the acronyms and the dates of the Cuban Missile Crisis and all the little technical things. In a sense, it's kind of finding a way to come to terms with the pure horror of nuclear war and nuclear risk, and then being able, in a very kind of emotionally mature way, to deal with that and say, yes, let's get on with abolishing these weapons of mass destruction. So thanks everybody who's been in our webinar. I'm sorry, I'm really sorry about my clunkiness on the screen sharing, but I'm really grateful to have been here with Amel and with Ray. So thank you both very much.
Most welcome.
Thank you.
And come back on Saturday. Bye then.
Bye now.